Hello, I'm Dave Ferraro from Comics and More.
And I'm Patrick Markfort from Articulate Nerd. Welcome to the first of a four-part series here on the Comics and More podcast. This is going to be a special series of podcasts where we examine the DC New 52 initiative. This is, of course, a DC Comics major relaunch effort that's going to be running through the month of September, in which they have relaunched and will relaunch every book that they publish. So everything
In
that
the DC universe.
in the DC universe. So everything that DC is putting out is restarting with a new number one issue. In some cases, brand new characters. In many cases, new versions of existing characters. In some cases, brand new titles. In most cases, brand new creative teams, many featuring kind of top-tier talent. So it's a major initiative by DC to kind of revamp and relaunch their entire line. It's been getting a lot of media attention from both the comics press as well as mainstream media like the New York Times and USA Today, etc. So this is going to be kind of our approach. We're going to be looking at, we're going to review a few books of that particular week's releases. We won't be reviewing everything, but we're going to try to get a generous sampling of these new books that DC is putting out. So we'll be reviewing a few on each of these four episodes, and then probably in the last episode we'll talk a little bit about our impressions of DC's The New 52 overall. So,
And it should be noted that the end of Flashpoint made it so they could kind of relaunch the whole universe, with kind of tweaking people's origins and stuff like that. So all of these books have characters we're familiar with, but the history may not have gone down in the way that we have become familiar with over the years.
right.
So they can kind of retcon it a little bit. It almost feels a little bit like an Ultimate Universe, a little bit.
Yeah, they've essentially, this was all preceded by a miniseries called Flashpoint, big crossover, which, similar to something like Crisis on Infinite Earths in the 1980s, essentially wiped the slate clean and gave DC and the artists and writers and editors a chance to kind of, start over. And some books I would imagine are going to be similar to what had been going on before. I can't imagine they'll take a radical new approach to something like Geoff John's Green Lantern, would seem to have been working pretty well, but it's been an opportunity for them to take a look at their entire line and kind of see what works and what doesn't. Okay, well, with that kind of rambling introduction to this series, let's jump right into it with our review of Justice League #1. This is, I think it would be safe to say, the flagship title in the New 52 initiative. It was actually put out last week. It was the only of the new #1 books put out last week alongside the final issue of the Flashpoint miniseries. So this kind of kicked off this whole project. It is written by Geoff Johns, and it has art by Jim Lee. I don't think you could pick a creative team more representative of mainstream comics right now than Geoff Johns, very popular writer. He's done work on Green Lantern and The Flash to great success the past several years for DC, and also was the writer, primary architect behind the Flashpoint miniseries. And Jim Lee, of course, huge superstar artist, one of the Image founders and editor, one of the main publishers at DC Comics right now. And their writing and art styles are very representative of what I think of as kind of just like mainstream superhero comics. So it seemed to me like an appropriate launch book. So this first issue of Justice League is essentially the first part of the origin story of the Justice League, the new version of the Justice League. It's not a complete story in and of itself, and it has taken some criticism for that online. But it begins to tell the story of how these heroes come together. So it opens up with an action sequence with Batman chasing down this this kind of cyborg monster character through the streets of Gotham while the police are chasing him. So we jump right into the action, which I liked. Very quickly, he's joined by Green Lantern, and those two characters meet for the first time. And they seem pretty close to the versions of the characters that we've known. Green Lantern seems a bit younger, a bit cockier, but it's essentially the Green Lantern and Batman that most people would be familiar with. So they team up, they have a battle with this monster character who it turns out is going to have some ties to Apocalypse and Darkseid and all of those great Jack Kirby characters, so that could be a lot of fun. And their investigation of this creature eventually brings them to Metropolis, and on the very final page we get our first look at the new Superman, which is probably one of the more radical reinterpretations of a major character that DC is doing. So I liked this first issue of Justice League. It was kind of exactly what I wanted out of Justice League #1, written by Geoff Johns with art by Jim Lee. It was a good, straightforward superhero comic book. Plenty of action. There's not, a lot going on. It wasn't like a radical reinvention. It wasn't like some crazy kind of twist. It was just a good, straightforward story. I personally thought, too, that they had a pretty good mix of getting enough story and enough characters into this first issue while still having it serve as the first part of a longer arc. We've talked a lot on this podcast about the difficulty of reviewing single issues of comic books because everybody does this deconstructed storytelling. And this issue did take some flack for that online as kind of the new #1, supposed to bring in new readers, and you don't even see all of the new characters in this. A lot of flack about there not really being any female characters in this first issue. But personally, I thought they struck a pretty good note. You got 3 of the major characters. You see the character who we know will become Cyborg in a brief sequence. You had a fight with a villain. I thought introducing Superman on the very last page was a cool note to end it on. So to me, this comic book was a success. It's kind of what I think you would want to read about if you were picking up Justice League #1. So for me, the DC New 52 got off to a good start with Justice League #1. What was your take?
I agree. I think it is a really strong debut for the DC line. I thought it was paced perfectly. I didn't mind that there were just a few characters in it because, there's a lot of characters on this team and you don't want to cram them all in.
Yeah. And, as much as we ourselves have criticized, well, not really criticized, but we've commented in the past about how deconstructed stories are. You might just get a fraction of a story in a single issue. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think the trade-off for that is you get to spend more time kind of developing mood and atmosphere and character. I think if say DC had the initiative with this 52 to say, okay, we're not only relaunching everything, we're also telling self-contained stories in every issue, I don't think fans would respond really well to it because you'd have to sacrifice characterization, you'd have to sacrifice a lot of the more sophisticated, relatively speaking, literary techniques that superhero comics have adopted over the past 20, 30 years. But I thought there was a good balance in this issue.
I think so too. Yeah, right away with the characters you get who they are. The action scenes are played out really well. I did also like that Superman was, on the very last page, like how they introduced him.
Yep.
I thought that was really neat too. That monster that they were kind of chasing was kind of cool.
Cool.
And I like how, there was the brief mention of Darkseid there and stuff like that, so we kind of know some cool things are coming.
Yeah.
But it's a lot like I feel like Geoff Johns' work on Green Lantern. It's kind of, almost a sprawling storyline, and obviously it's going to get galactic kind of, like pretty epic.
Yeah.
So I like where it's going, where you can see it going. I am, anxious for the other members to be introduced into the team like Wonder Woman.
But you should be, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's whetting your appetite a little bit for those characters that you're dying to see. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it, though.
Yeah, and Geoff Johns and Jim Lee and Scott Williams, who does really nice inking here, are not my favorite writers and artists working in comics. They're probably maybe my favorites working in mainstream comics, but I do like them both a lot. And again, I just think they're so representative of kind of popular mainstream comic book artist and writer. It's just made a really appealing package. It's probably as close as comics can get to like a blockbuster summer movie, which may not be a great goal to aim for, but in the case of this issue, it was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of crossovers that try to incorporate a lot of characters into them, they just aren't very good because they're trying to appeal to the fans a lot, you know what I mean? Trying to get like these, you know, epic scenes like in Blackest Night, like especially they just tried to incorporate like, oh, Batman as a, you know, as a Black Lantern, you know, all that stuff. This, I feel like they're just telling the story of like this you know, slowly rolling out this team of characters. It's a more not bogging it down in a bunch of stuff. They're not necessarily catering to the fans. They're gonna slowly roll them on.
It was a little bit like a breath of fresh air. Yeah. It was kind of streamlined, kind of straightforward approach, nicely illustrated, bright colors.
Yeah, they could have gone on another direction and it wouldn't have worked out as well. Yep. So I think they picked the right way to go with this one. And this is like a kind of flashback. It takes place 5 years, I think it said before. Yeah. Like the current time. So obviously in the current DC universe there is a Justice League right now. And they actually kind of mentioned Justice League and Animal Man, which we'll be reviewing shortly. Right. But this takes place 5 years ago, and this is kind of their origin. And
superheroes are still kind of new in this world, and we'll talk a little bit about that in Action Comics, which presumably takes place kind of in the same period. Yeah. Very good.
All right.